depending on where you are. Good evening as well. It is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Ashley Moore's work on queer inclusion in language education has been published in TESOL Quarterly, ELT Journal, and the Modern Language Journal. As a teacher, educator, and industry consultant, he's passionate about helping people to create critical frameworks of inquiry and action that support equity and inclusion. Ashley, please, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks a lot for the introduction, Cecilia. So I'm just gonna minimize this a little bit. I'm not super great at multitasking. I thought Helen did an amazing job of that earlier on today, but I'm not very good, so I won't be able to monitor the chat as much, but if anything pops up, I'd really appreciate it. That is urgent, just let me know.
I will, don't worry.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm a PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia. My supervisor is actually Yuko Kubota, who's been sort of mentioned a lot, especially in terms of race in ELT and language teaching in general at this conference. So some of you may know her and her work. Today, I'll be talking about a practical framework for combating race and gender privilege or normativity in ELT materials. Okay. So a very brief overview. Actually, before I give the overview, I'd like to acknowledge that here in Vancouver and in the West End as well, I'm living and working on the Coast Salish, Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, Stolo, Musqueam, and Stuminus territories, unceded, ancestral, and traditional. Yeah, and I'm privileged to be here, and I also acknowledge that I'm largely an uninvited guest on this land as well. And that's important because one of the kinds of racism that I'll be talking about in ELT will be specifically that directed at Indigenous people. So we're probably about 5 minutes in already, but after that, I'm going to give a brief overview of the taxonomy of representational heteronormativity. So very specifically focused at sexuality that I just recently published actually earlier this year in ELT Journal. After that, I'm going to explore the idea, and I've been exploring it all weekend by going into various different presentations that I hope to draw on and bring in to this work as well, to see, can the taxonomy travel to help us unpick representations of race and queer gender in the materials that we use to teach. So not just textbooks, but movies, YouTube videos, TV, all things like that, books. Can it help us to identify what kind of representations are happening? And also perhaps, can the taxonomy help us to plot a path towards better representations that are less damaging? And that's maybe a contentious idea that I'm introducing here, and I'd love to get feedback on, but what I'm going to be arguing is that not all forms of oppressive representation are necessarily as damaging as others. And so the progress that we can make in certain contexts might be less, but we should always be striving to do the very best we can. And then if we have time, I'd love to open it into some small kind of breakout room discussions where we might be able to apply the taxonomy I'm going to present today to some materials that you know of or some text that you've used in your own teaching. And then right at the end, if we have time, we can have a full room questions and comments as well. Sound good? I'm imagining you nodding. All right, so this is the taxonomy of representational heteronormativity. So in this work, I really specifically focused in on queer sexuality. And as I said, I've outlines kind of 5 different types. And some of these, I want you to think back to some of the examples that presenters like Abigail just previously and all through the conference have shared with us, and think about if you had to name them using the taxonomy I'm going to present today, which one would it be? And perhaps controversially, as they said, I'm arguing end of the scale is explicit heterosexism. I can give you an example of this. By the way, all the references for the images and all the work I'm going to refer to are on the final slide. So everybody knows Franz, I think. It's very common. Teaching text as well for a lot of language classes, but we also know that when we look at it now, and even at the time people were saying this as well, let's not forget that in terms of especially queer male behaviors and relationships, Franz was incredibly homophobic or heterosexist, if you like. So I'm sure a lot of you know this episode where Ross and Joey discover that they love napping together. And then right at the end, the sort of final laugh is that the other friends discover them. And although it's obviously played for laughs, you can see here they're sitting there with their arms folded and such. It's very much frowned upon. And that runs throughout the whole series, as many of you will know. Whereas female same-sex behavior is celebrated for the male gaze when they frequently ask the female friends to kiss and things like that. Male same-sex desire or eroticism is completely frowned upon and played for laughs in that sense as well. So this would be an example of a text that is often used in language classes that could be explicitly heterosexist. Moving to the next kind, which is heteronormativity, which is heteronormative erasure. And we've heard a lot about this over the course of this and in the literature as well, but also especially in this conference. I'm saying that this is less damaging, still inherently heteronormative, I have to say, but less damaging. I can give you an example of this. I invite you all to do this on your phones right now. Type in dating in a Google image search. And interestingly, the racial diversity that we see is actually quite broad. But in terms of sexuality, this is a screenshot. If it was the real thing, I scrolled for pages and pages and pages. And it's really interesting. Absolutely only men-women pairs, which makes me think that there's an algorithm there somewhere that is filtering that out. Because if queer images were going to show up on somebody's internet search, it would be mine. And this kind of heteronormative erasure, I'm sure most of you know, if you open the vast majority of textbooks that we use explicitly for teaching English or other languages, we know that queer sexual relationships, families, desire is just absolutely conspicuous by its accents. Moving up to the next level, which again, I'm going to argue is still heteronormative, but less damaging. So really, I should probably change these to damaging, really. I think that's more helpful. Is heteronormative marginalization. I'll give you an example from my own work, because I'm certainly not suggesting that, and this is what I mean when I want to talk about a continuum and to acknowledge that sometimes even our best efforts can sometimes end up still perpetrating or perpetuating heteronormativity. So this is a textbook that I published with a group of other authors. I've done it since 2013 in Japan, where I used to live and work. It's called Insights. It's we take newspaper articles and make reading comprehension things. This is recorded, so I won't talk about the project as a whole. But in 2018, I managed to negotiate with my co-authors and the publishers to have a chapter that was specifically about LGBT folk in Japan as well. And I've done a lot of thinking about this kind of representation and inclusion, so I did my best. I found an article that was generally quite positive in terms of its spin. And I worked with the Japanese kind of main co-author for that chapter, and we talked about how we could get it as right as possible. And I won't lie, I was quite proud about the work that I'd done here, because as far as I know, and I'm almost certain this is true, this is the only textbook published in Japan for a Japanese market that has ever mentioned LGBTQ issues and lives. And when I got my final printed copy, I found it here, chapter 20. So they tucked it away. It says, a step forward to become yourself. The Japanese here, jibun rashiku aru. I can't read that last one, but basically, yeah, no mention of LGBTQ issues anywhere. So they put it at the end in the hopes, I think, that people wouldn't get to it. And so this year's cohort of students who took this book at university probably had no idea that this was ever in there. So in this sense, it was marginalized. And I will update you to say that right now we're working on the 2022, and I've gone back and said we need another one in there. They've said yes, and I found a great article that connects LGBTQ inclusion with the Olympics in Tokyo. And I've explicitly said we did it, and then I said, right, now, this time it's going much further in the book, and with a title, hopefully, that will make it very clear that it's about LGBTQ issues as well, or people. So we'll see, fingers crossed that we're slowly making progress. But the 2018, we can see it. It's literally physically marginalized within the book itself. It's right at the end. And we can, I know a lot of people have talked about tokenism. This would be an example. Heteronormative marginalization is a term that we can use to explain tokenism as well. So a one-off depiction. Or indeed things like stereotypical representations as well, because that's a single story. So it's kind of a reduced story as well. Moving up another step, again, I'm going to argue, perhaps controversially, that this is less damaging, heteronormative normalization. Sometimes this is called homonormativity. I've chosen to, actually, in the published version of this, it's called heteronormative mainstreaming, because obviously I don't want to repeat normalization. Sorry, it's a slightly older table from an earlier draft. But this, yeah, heteronormative mainstreaming. And in this sense, I found this great article on this is a British Council free resource, and it's about families. It's aimed at younger learners, and it's got a bunch of pictures of various different families drawn adorably by children, I hope. And they have to match it to the description of the families. And in this one, Eric's family is this one. So this is my family. I haven't got a mom, but I've got two dads. I've got two grandmas and two grandpas too. They come for lunch every Sunday. So in this sense, it is this act of normalization that I know a lot of people have talked about, and usualization, if you like. But we also have to remember that this inclusion is dependent, this kind of inclusion, on us being good gays or following heteronormative norms. In this case, sort of having kids, presumably being in a stable monogamous relationship. So it's inclusion, but in the terms that that is dependent on us following the norms set by the mainstream as well. So that's why I've used the word mainstreaming here, because it obviously has a bit of a critique that we can put at mainstream as well. And I want to add that in there.
Can I just add, Ashley, that Catherine, that article is by Catherine Billsborough, and she's in the session, and she just said, "Oh, that's my article," and everybody. So you made her day for that.
Yeah, and I was so happy when I discovered this, because we could see people. I could see people actually doing the work. This was a fantastic step forward. And actually, when you consider the age range that lesson is aimed at, it's fantastic, really brave work. So thank you, Catherine. It's amazing that to actually meet the people doing this work. The last step would be something like queer inclusion. To my knowledge, there are no examples of this in published materials. Oh, actually, no, that's wrong. The Raise Up work, actually, the Raise Up project, and I know Ila, and forgive me if that's poor pronunciation of your name, and James Taylor, I think, right? James Taylor, have done that work. So that actually is recent to me, work that is doing that. But in terms of sort of major publishing houses, we certainly find very few examples. And apart from, obviously, this is one that our facilitator, our creator, Tyson has done. This is from the mock-up unit that I'm sure lots of us are aware of. I thought this was a fantastic example of of what I'm describing could be termed queer inclusion. In this case, we have people who are queer, who index same-sex attraction and romantic relationships. They don't always have to be good. It's kind of a balance. They're neither good nor bad. They're just out there living their lives. They are mentioned in connection to things that aren't necessarily where their sexual identity is not the main focus. And they're allowed to have a wide range of interests, but at the same time, their sexual identity or orientation is touched upon. It's not ignored. It's not to borrow the term from race. It's not a colorblind approach where everybody's just the same. I guess this is the idea of actualization that I heard some people talking about as well. The step forward. So it's kind of a balanced representation. It doesn't always rely on fixed, essentialized categories either. The great thing I love about what Tyson's done here is that Jeremy's unemployed. People are almost never unemployed in textbooks. So definitely allowed to be something more complex than just normal. And also dating. People are rarely allowed to be single and actively dating in textbooks. And I'm sure that that was a conscious decision on Tyson's part, which I feel, what a great example to help people envisage what can actually be done. And again, the point in this whole unit that he's developed is about work-life balance as well. So the focus, the things that are incidental but meaningfully incorporated. And of course, as we know, and we've seen throughout this conference, representation is also important in terms of race and gender too. And so what I want to ask is, can the taxonomy travel to race and gender? Can these concepts be widened? And of course, this makes sense as, sorry, her name's just Amanda, whose presentation I watched earlier this morning, which was fantastic, reminded us race is a social construction. As Helen reminded us, gender is a social construction. These are socially constructed categories that are used to kind of discipline and order and hierarchize us, all of us. And so I think that, and the more I think about it, the more I'm convinced that the taxonomy can actually be widened and be very useful in terms of plotting a path towards better representations. I'll give some examples from work that I've seen, and again, I've managed to put, I think, the correct references for these all at the end. So David Valente talked about a Scottish teaching text that he'd found in Scotland that was a letter on a kind of billboard campaign against both homophobia and transphobia as well. And that text could be used for teaching. The Taylor talked about the dominance of white inner circle models of pronunciation and the lack of representations of Black speaking subjects as well. Participant in Taylor's presentation, forgive me for not mentioning your name here, but also because you might not want your name mentioned. Representations of Black people that focus on Black pain at the expense of Black joy as well. Chris yesterday talked about a lack of trans representation in analyzed textbooks used in, that should be Spain, obviously. This is what happens when you keep your, when you update your slides as you go. The absence of visual stereotypes of rich Black lives and instead focus on deficiencies and stereotypes that Amanda uncovered in her research, and the lack of Black and transgender presentation that Helen found in their research as well, in the books that they were using in Spain. And so this is the taxonomy of representational heteronormativity. Ta-da! This is something wider that I think could work quite usefully. So a taxonomy of historically non-normative, or we could say also, I think, marginalized identity representation. And so explicit heterosexism has become explicit discrimination, normative erasure, marginalized inclusion, mainstreamed inclusion, and critical inclusion. And I'm gonna, how are we doing for time? 9:23, we're doing all right. And I'm gonna argue still, and this again might be contentious, that at this lower level, it's more normative and more damaging. And at this higher level, it's less normative and less damaging. We might never escape the damage that can potentially be done by any active representation, but we can certainly minimize it. And I think, certainly in my experience, and I'm also a person of color, I'm a person of color in a sense that doesn't always impact my life very much because I carry around a lot of white privilege with me as well, in various forms. But I do feel like it holds true across my lived experience and what people say when I listen to theirs as well. But this would be very interesting and up for some discussion at the end. So I'll give some examples as we go through. And when I talk about gender, I'm talking about queer gender here specifically, not necessarily female representations, cis female representations in books. That's important work, but it's not what I'm talking about today. So embrace, this is an example from my supervisor actually, Liuko. She found this in a book, this is Brinton. It's in a teacher training book actually. And in this passage on the kind of gold rush in California, and it's done in a kind of reading, how to teach reading comprehension chapter in this book. And it talks about the prospectors traveling through hostile Native American lands. If this is and this is actually, I would say, explicit discrimination in terms of representation, that the people are raised in that sense, and they are only really, it's very much told from the white colonizer's perspective. I don't think colonizer is really mentioned here at all. It's a US contingent in covered wagons through hostile Native American lands. This is obviously incredibly problematic. And I'll come back to this because Liuko actually chased up some of the author and engaged in a dialogue, I should say. And there was some movement, but we can debate whether it was positive movement. In terms of queer gender, I think if you've watched the Netflix movie, I think it's called Disclosure, right? The trans documentary on Netflix. And that one singles out, amongst, sadly, lots of examples, but Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, is an incredibly transphobic film. I won't go into details because I think it's very upsetting, but this is an example where, yeah, it's just full of transphobia. Going on to normative erasure. So after Ryuko, and you can find, she talks about this in a recent talk in October, and in the references, there's a link to the YouTube video of that. It was a talk that she gave at UBC's Department of Asian Studies, so you can see that. So after Ryuko engaged in a dialogue with the author, the text was changed. She found a different example of the text. It's actually got the same kind of reference. It's still Brinton 2014, but so under difficult, and so now it says, these early gold seekers, who were called 49ers, sailed around the tip of South Africa and crossed the US contingent covered in covered wagons under difficult and sometimes life-threatening circumstances. So now Native Americans completely erased from the text. Possibly, I would argue, not as bad as saying hostile Native American lands, but still not great. They're just erased from history. And as we know, in terms of queer gender, it's absolutely erased in the overwhelming vast majority of not just ELT materials, but language teaching materials in general. Moving on to marginalized inclusion, and I'm slightly terrified now because, you know, there's people in the talk that might be here. I don't think they're here, and I would be willing to stand by my critique anyway. So this is a book that my friend was using to teach teacher training course, Teacher's Handbook, and this is something that JPB, Gerald, right? Those are his initials. Our keynote speaker from yesterday was talking about, we have to get into teacher education to start talking about race. But what happens when we look at the textbooks that are designed to train teachers? In the section on, it's about diversity in language teaching. It says students who are at risk are often from certain heritage groups, such as African American, Hispanic, Asian, or Native American. This is really the only time. It's completely deficit-based approach. So it's well-meaning. The idea is that teachers would, I don't know, think about special measures they might take to look at, but it totally positions racialized students as being at risk. And because of that racialization, not because of racism, which is actually what places groups at risk, is racism, systemic and individual racism. This would be an example, I think, of problematic issues of race. And I think also Amanda touched on this earlier today when she was talking about Black people being represented in terms of needing help, especially this kind of white savior narrative as well. In terms of queer gender, at this year's online TESOL conference, I made a point of sending a message to all of the reps from the major publishing houses. And I asked them, can you tell me, what are you doing to increase queer inclusivity in the materials that you produce? Most of them did not get back to me. Most of them had terrible answers. And so I feel awful because this company was one of the few that actively really engaged with me. And so hats off to them. And they are definitely miles ahead of the others. So the company is called Saddleback Books, Saddleback Educational Books. And they sent me a whole load of young adult, like high-low readers that focus on this. This is one, The Space Between, and And I'll read the blurb. Eric lives by his dojo's creed. MMA is his life. When his old girlfriend moves back to town, she shatters everything he believes in. Danielle now goes by Dan. Eric's honesty and integrity are questioned. What does it mean to live your truth, and what happens when others are cruelly ignorant? So I think the whole point of this book is to try and make things better. However, when we look at the framing, this and all of the books they sent me actually were part of their Gravel Road series. And on the website, it says Gravel Road, no topic is off limits. Suicide, homosexuality, drugs, rape, gangs, bullying. So you can see the framing here is definitely in a marginalized kind of deficiency or problems-based way. I didn't see this talk earlier today, but I know, forgive me, the name escapes me. I know people were talking about this idea of a debate, something else that Cynthia Nelson writes about definitely avoiding is the idea that our identities, who we are, is up for debate. Blech. In terms of mainstreamed inclusion, we might find this in terms of race. Again, I'm going to use Friends here because it's an example that we all know. Friends was critiqued at the time and obviously now in terms of being an incredibly white show with white writers, I think, as well. And this kind of shows in the way that they were eventually, Ross was sort of thrown a black girlfriend, and she's the character Charlie is often critiqued in terms of the fact that she's very white as a character in terms of her portrayal. She's not allowed, and not that you have to be one thing, but it's just notable that the only way that a black character could get a recurring part in Friends was to basically mimic the white norms of the main characters as well. And we see this also in terms of queer gender. The example I thought of was Transamerica. This was perhaps one of the main films that really broke through into the mainstream of the kind of public consciousness. But the main character, she's very nice. She's played by a cisgendered actress. So this could only ever be something, I think, that was mainstream and reliant on us conforming to certain norms. Again, I don't mean this in any way as a critique of people who transition from one side of the binary to the other, but a kind of mainstream inclusion in terms of queer gender would only feature those people and not necessarily non-binary folks or people who really challenged the gender boundary, binary. Lastly, again, in terms of critical inclusion, I have to turn to kind of popular texts or imaginary texts like Tyson's, sorry. So I thought about race. And again, I think this is a point that Amanda made this morning. It's really important that these things are kind of authored by the people that the texts represent. So this is Issa Rae's Insecure. I know a lot of you will have seen it. This is a great program. I love this. It just displays her life in all its rich complexity. She's, and you know, as a fully holistic, fully formed human being, all of the characters in the show. And it's told from their perspective. They're allowed to be good, bad, insecure, confident, professional, unprofessional, all those things that human beings are. This would be an example, I think, of critical inclusion of race in a text. And in terms of gender, Tyson, I hope you're blushing or you know, saying, oh. I thought this was a great example, actually, because again, we have non-binary people featured in the textbook. They use they pronouns. We also have a drag queen later on who also is kind of fucking with gender, if you like. And also working in a bar as well. In a sense, she teaches candy cane reads stories to children at the library, you know, like drag queen story time. Some, you know, is that normalization or mainstreaming? Not really, because she works in a bar. She's definitely, she's playing with gender. That's the whole point of drag. She's challenging those norms. So I actually think this is, that chapter also is a great example of critical inclusion as well, in terms of queer genders. But it is an example that Tyson's made for everybody to, you know, to challenge us to think better, and especially publishers. We've yet to see this taken up by mainstream, you know, huge publishers. So that's quite enough of me talking. We got to 9:30, so oh, it's pretty good. So I wonder, well, it's up to you really. We could do either small groups, or look at what's been going on in the chat and do like a broad discussion maybe. That might be better. Yeah, we've got 10 minutes. Some things you might not agree with then. Before I finish, I'll critique myself. The idea that damage is on a continuum and that some forms of representation can be still inherently oppressive, but less damaging than others, that could be contentious. This uncoupling, theoretically, of oppression from damage, not everybody's going to agree with that. And also, I'm cisgendered, so I leave it up to my trans colleagues to tell me whether this could be a useful framework or not. And again, with other kinds of racialization as well, maybe this doesn't work. I'm not white, but like I said, it's that intersectionality point is important, and racism doesn't work in the same ways for all different people of color, Black and Indigenous people. So let me know if it works. What's the best way to go from there? Should we, maybe we'll just open it up to general questions and comments.
Sounds good. Any questions, guys? Comments? There was quite a bit of oh, the references. Everybody gonna want that. But there were quite a few comments and discussion going on in the chat about it. And some people were discussing when you mentioned Tyson's, and that he one of the participants mentioned that he'd done a good job in the stock photos search, because he'd mentioned that as a comment to what you presented, you know, do the search. By the way, I did the search and it's amazing. It's only heterosexual couples and things like that. So there has been a little bit of sharing of different stock photos websites that have more diverse, more normal, really, more authentic representation of people here. And there's been a bit of a discussion as well as about the whole debate of mainstream publisher. It's a question that you asked as well, you know. Is it easier for the, or was it somebody who said, no, I think it was in the chat, if they would do it, it would be easier, but they're not interested in doing that, are they? Or they don't seem to.
I do know somebody who works for one of the big mainstream publishers got in touch and asked for a copy of that paper. And I know Ben Goldstein has written about this as well. So I do know that they are trying very hard behind the scenes, like particular people on the teams. And I know that paper, the taxonomy, has been circulated around amongst the writers group, and hopefully ways like that can help people. We might not all be able to jump to critical inclusion. Somebody asked me, I was giving kind of a guest spot in a class at the University of Saskatchewan, Regina, can't remember, sorry. And somebody there was obviously, I think, embedded in a much more conservative context. And they said, well, what can I do? And I said, well, just try and take a step, whatever you've got now, try and take a step forward to something that's less damaging in the terms of the taxonomy as well. So I think that is important, that we might not all, in all cases, be able to jump or be embedded in contexts where we can safely make that jump for us and our students, but we can do something that's less damaging. And the fact that they're on this taxonomy means that we've always got our eye towards something ideal, hopefully, as well, or more ideal.
We have a question from Victor Hugo Medina. He asks you, could you talk a little bit about how LGBTQ allies can contribute regarding the issues you brought up in your talk?
Yes, definitely. I think the first thing is have conversations with your colleagues. I hope everybody here, whether you're an ally or a part of these communities, I hope that what happens is, and I'm sure a lot of you have felt this frustration sometimes, although it's still very important, these kind of opportunities for community and sharing ideas and energy, I sometimes feel like I'm preaching to the choir with a lot of these things. The people that come to my workshops are sometimes doing a better job at inclusion than I am, quite frankly, and I get more ideas from them. But it's the colleagues who might not necessarily have thought about these things. So we need to find ways. I hope people will share tools like the taxonomy and other tools that I hope people will share Tyson's example unit and build it into the PD days that they have in their institutions, and just get people thinking and talking, because it occurs to us that this is important. A lot of us, because we've lived through, I lived through Section 28 in the UK, which was enforced the whole time I was at school, which was an explicitly homophobic law that shaped what could or couldn't be said about non-heterosexual forms of relationships. And so I know why this is important to me, and I understand the need, but not everybody does, especially if you've lived with a lot of privilege. So I think if you're an ally, it's your job to go out there and tap your co-workers on the shoulders and put this under their noses. Thanks, Victor.
Any more questions, any comments, guys? Carol, hi, Carol. Carol says that the concept of damage in the taxonomy is interesting and thought-provoking. Marginalized inclusion, which understands deficit model and positioning people as problems to be fixed or to be helped, seems particularly harmful and opens up the possibility of erasure and explicit discrimination. Really useful taxonomy.
Yeah, and I do think sometimes there's going to be a very thin line between marginalized inclusion and explicit. I think the difference for me is in terms of intention. And I do think most of us are pretty happy with the idea of intentionality. Like, you can, it doesn't hurt me as much if somebody blunders unknowingly and does something, as if somebody is going out of their way, like the Thatcher government was going out of its way with Section 28 to make queer people's lives worse in the UK. That was intentional. That is much more harmful to me than my identity being included, but kind of perhaps like these people need our help, or aren't they amazing sources of inspiration, those kind of things. That all works to marginalize and other us, right? But it's less damaging, and I can do more with that. I can do more with that in terms of pushing things forward in a more critically inclusive way. I can talk about, this shouldn't be the only stories that you're telling about us or them.
Fantastic. No, I think, and it was actually discussing this issue with Tyson. He opened my eyes to a lot of how the marginalization, and it actually makes the problem worse sometimes in the way that people include. But it's, you know, it's good that we're here and we're discussing this and we're making this movement. And as you said, I actually work for a big publisher, and we do have people. There is, I think there is a wish to do that, but there's a lot more fear of damaging themselves, you know, to be the first one to actually do it, or how to do it without damaging, taking big hits on commercially speaking. But I think we are moving forward, not as quickly as we should or would hope to. But
yeah.
Oh, Ty, do you want to take over?
Sure. I would say what I kind of envision happening. I don't know if this is a magical dreamland that I'm envisioning, but I sort of feel like once one publisher does it, then it's just going to go boom, 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 and everybody's going to get on board. The reason I say that a little bit is because if you think about like 3 years ago, no publisher was talking about gay inclusion or racial diversity at all. And then we had a couple of talks at different conferences, blah, 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 blah. And then I wake up now and they're just all over the place. Like everybody's talking about it, at least, you know, it's not moving so fast, but it's talking about it. And so it was, you know, just an interesting thing that I hope will actualize in terms of actual production of something. And I mean, I'm super stoked that you included my coursebook unit, Ashley, but you know, I was kind of hoping that that would be an instigator, like that would be the, okay, somebody did it, English, someone did it. Maybe all of a sudden everybody's going to do it now. And, you know, Raise Up is, you know, a good example of somebody doing it. And maybe it's just not the publishers at the moment who will, but I think eventually it's just going to go.
I think also coming back to Victor's point about what allies and what everybody can do is do what I did, start asking the publishers when we meet them, when, you know, they love to put the books in our hands at the booths and things and be like, oh, well, we've got this. And, you know, ask, how is this book in terms of, tell me about the kind of representations of race and queer gender in here. How is, and they should know the answers to these questions. And it will get back to them because they have to fill out reports, I think, you know, about what's happened. And this is how they understand that there is a demand there as well. It's a business. Like, make them understand. And if it's not there, be like, even if you go away and buy it afterwards, just don't let them know that you're buying it. Be like, well, it's not really what I'm looking for. Totally. And then walk away, because then they'll learn.
Yeah, and if they're embarrassed by not being able to speak to those things, to your questions, right. And then you go like, you know what, actually, I don't want your book. You know, that says something.
I think that's actually a great idea, Ashley. I mean, you are right. We have to start voicing and asking those questions and getting them to really know that we are talking about that, and that the issue is noticed. We notice that, and the lack of that in the books, and we want that in the books that we use. But I also like what you did, you know, the point you brought up about the need, as Tyson put in the chat earlier on, we have to bring this issue into all levels of teaching, not just materials, teacher training in many levels, the students. There are so many layers there, and it's important that we remember that there are so many layers, and we act on all of them.
You could use that taxonomy with students to critique the crap text that we have to use already. You know, like it's a great framework for talking about this. those things and naming what it is as well. Yes, it's included, but it's done so in a very marginalizing way.
And to get the students to notice that, to understand that as well. And it's
Also, I think that the teachers are often they're invited to focus groups by the publishers, and they're asked to give feedback on materials. And I think that this is something that teachers could start actually saying, you know, because if you look at I've been to those focus groups and I've looked at those feedback questionnaires, and usually they don't even touch on things like representation. So maybe that's something that coming from teachers, that they could actually request that they add something like that, or they could just put it in their feedback. And that's actually quite something that, I mean, there are loads more teachers than there are people working for publishers. So I think that's something that could be quite powerful, because at the end of the day, publishers are businesses and their number one priority is to sell books. So they just want to keep their stakeholders happy, and teachers are the ones who, I think they have got some kind of power there.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks for the contribution, Catherine. It is 10 to, well, it's 8 to now. So I'm actually going to cut us off just so that everybody can feel like they can take a break if they want to before the next session, even though this has been fascinating. So thanks so much, Ashley, for being a part of this conference. We really benefited from your talk. So thank you so much. And for everyone else, I'm going to stop the recording now.